Greetings, colleagues. My name is Anastasia Buchok, and I work for the Center of Thought Leadership at Global Green Growth Institute in South Korea. It's a very sunny day here in Seoul, and I wish we all could have been in one room. And for now, on behalf of our team, let me extend our warm welcome to each of you, whether you are joining from the ministry or an international organization, a private company, academia, a civil society group, or a community on the front lines of the climate change. Your presence here today shows that the just transition is no longer a niche concept, it's a shared responsibility and a common challenge. And we are here because we know that we are moving to a net zero world, and it's not just about technology or carbon targets, it's about people. And it's about the jobs, communities, dignity, and fairness. And transition that leaves behind workers, regions, and vulnerable groups is not just unjust, it's unsustainable. That's why we are focusing today on incorporating just transitions into development policies and translating those into action. And LTLETs, for example, are meant to be our roadmaps for the next 20 and 30 years. And if we want those roadmaps to lead us to an equitable future, they must be embed just transition as at their core. Now, let me be honest, most countries still struggle to move from good intentions to concrete plans, and we see the gaps in specific actions, in finance, in measurable targets, and in monitoring. But it's not about pointing fingers, it's about learning together. And this is why we all are here together, and we brought such a remarkable group of distinguished voices today. We have government leaders from India, Indonesia, who are turning strategy into the real policies and projects on the ground. We have international organizations like ILO who bring global expertise on green jobs, social protection, just transition frameworks. We have civil society and independent worker experts who remind us that no transition is just unless it listens to the most affected communities. And we have GGI economists and country leads who work day to day on the front lines of the climate change in finance with social justice, to align the climate finance with the social justice. And each of our panelists sees just transition from a very different angle, but today they help us answer one central question: how do we move from long-term strategy to concrete action that leaves no one behind? And over the next 90 minutes, we'll share evidence, the country experiences, practical ideas, especially as we look ahead to the COP31 and operationalization of Just Transition Work Program. So please participate actively. Please take note that this webinar is recorded, and recording will be shared with the speakers and with the participants after this webinar. Also, please feel free to join the chat. The chat is open for everyone, and ask your questions in the Q&A session. And for now, I'm very happy to hand over to Ms. Rushika Dral, Deputy Secretary to Government of India, Climate Change Division, Ministry of Environment and Forest and Climate Change. And over to you, Rushika Dral. Thank you.
Thank you, Anastasia. And thank you, GGGI, for inviting me to this very important discussion on translating ambition to action and embedding just transition into the long-term low emission development strategies. I would like to first of all comment the efforts of GGGI in putting together this brief insight on how just transition is being integrated into the long-term emission development strategies of some of the G20 countries. And I'm sure this study will be valuable going forward, as it provides a very important evidence-based assessment on how just transition considerations are reflected in G20 long-term strategies. And by systematically examining the governance, the workforce, the regional development, financing, and monitoring dimensions, the study very clearly highlights both the areas of progress and also some of the gaps between the ambition and implementation. I feel that such analytical work is extremely useful in helping refine the future LTLEDs and strengthen collective learning across the countries. India appreciates GGI's continued engagement with the developing countries, and also putting equity and fairness at the center of long-term climate planning. As far as India's LT-LEDS is concerned, it is firmly rooted in the principles of equity, climate justice, and sustainable development, as reflected in the Paris Agreement. And our approach clearly recognizes that climate action cannot be pursued in isolation. It has to be along the national development priorities, poverty eradication, energy access. And India, as a developing country, has a very unique developmental context. India is home to one-sixth of the world population. However, our historical contribution to global greenhouse gas emissions has been extremely low. We continue to face the significant development and energy needs, and we also have responsibilities to provide affordable energy, housing, mobility, and livelihoods to the people of the country. India is also one of the countries that are most vulnerable to the impacts of climate, making adaptation and resilience as central to our planning. At the same time, India is fully committed to pursuing low carbon and climate resilient development pathways that are consistent with national circumstances. Accordingly, the India's long-term emission development strategy is guided by the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities, and we recognize our right to a fair share of global carbon budget. The strategy was developed through an extensive interministerial consultation with inputs from the various line ministries, state governments, research institutions, and other stakeholders, ensuring that there is a clear alignment with the broader national policies and now India's submitted its LT-LEDs in 2022 that articulates our long-term vision to achieve net zero emissions by 2070. And the vision represents a development first, inclusive, and pragmatic pathway rather than a one size fit all approach. We focus on seven key transitions. The first one being the low carbon electricity systems that focus on rapid expansion of renewable energy, strengthening our transmission networks, and bringing in grid flexibility at the same time. Then we focus on low carbon transport systems that include electrification of the transportation sector, use of cleaner fuels, enhanced use of public transport and modal shift. Then there is sustainable urbanization that goes by promoting energy efficient building, climate resilient urban planning, and improved waste management. The low carbon industrial systems are dependent on energy efficiency, electrification, green hydrogen, and circular economy approaches. We also focus on carbon dioxide removal and emerging technologies through ecosystem-based approaches and carbon capture, utilization, and storage. We place an equal importance to enhancing and strengthening the carbon sinks by enhancing forestation and tree cover. And finally, finance, technology, and innovation has been clearly identified as one of the key enablers to all the transitions that we are looking at. Now, all these transitions have been intentionally sequenced and calibrated to ensure energy security, affordability, and economic growth while progressing towards reducing emission intensity. And I would also want to emphasize here that India's approach to this transition the concept of just transition is very clearly embedded into across each of the sectors, even though the terminology might differ from country to country. For example, in the energy sector, we focus on scaling up renewable energy at the unprecedented pace. However, we side by side recognize that there is a need for gradual and managed transition, particularly in coal dependent regions. In the transport sector, while we are having policies on electric mobility, ethanol blending, and alternative fuels that are designed not only to reduce emissions, but also to create domestic manufacturing capacity and jobs. In the urban development, the initiatives like energy efficient building and sustainable waste management not only contribute to climate mitigation, but also improve the quality of life of the billions in the country. Similarly, the industrial sector focuses on energy efficiency, circular economy, and explicitly considers the needs for MSMEs and hard to abate sectors, ensuring that the competitiveness and the job retention is not impacted in any negative manner. In the forestry and land use action space, the interventions are designed to enhance carbon sink while also supporting the rural livelihoods and community participation. Therefore, India's experience demonstrates that the just transition cannot be a standalone policy. It must be mainstreamed into the developmental planning, sectoral missions, and social programs. While all these transitions are important, one of the critical enablers to it is the financing. Therefore, finance remains one of the central messages of the India's LTLEDs and also identified as one of the major bottlenecks in operationalizing long-term strategies. India has estimated that it will require about trillions of dollars in investment by mid of century, and the availability, affordability, and accessibility of this finance will actually determine whether these transitions are just and inclusive or uneven and disruptive. From India's perspective, we feel that international climate finance is a critical enabler, especially the concessional and grant-based finance. The support to technology transfer and capacity building is essential to enable low cost and scalable solutions. And the financing frameworks must also address the adaptation, resilience, social dimension, and not just the mitigation outcomes. Therefore, India strongly believes that the developed countries must honor and scale up their commitments under the agreements, and also, the multilateral development banks and climate funds must align their mandate more closely with the long-term transition pathways. Now, specifically talking about the GGGI's study that we are discussing in the webinar today, I feel that India, definitely welcomes the GGGI findings that while most G20 countries acknowledge just transition principles, many strategies lack specificity, financing roadmaps, and monitoring framework. These findings clearly resonate strongly with the broader international experience. And moving forward, future iterations of LTLEDs, particularly in the developing countries, would benefit from some of the findings that we have from this study. We need to come up with more sectoral and region-specific transition pathways. We need to have better identification of affected communities and workers. There needs to be stronger linkages between the long-term low-emission development strategies, NDCs, and other developmental plans. And finally, we need to have robust monitoring and evaluation frameworks in place that are supported by data and various indicators. So I feel that at the same time, it is important to recognize the capacity and the resource constraint faced by the developing countries. And parallelly, there is a need for international support to translate long-term vision into action. So before I conclude, I would want to once again highlight that India's LEDs represents a very balanced, equitable, and development-oriented pathway to long-term transition, and it reflects our commitment to global climate goals while ensuring that the climate action is supporting economic growth, poverty eradication, energy access, and social inclusion. As we move forward from strategy to action, forums such as these and the analytical contributions like GGGI's G20 study can play a critical role in fostering shared learning, strengthening implementation, and India looks forward to continued engagement on this forum and many others and other international partners in advancing a just, inclusive, and nationally appropriate low carbon transition. Thank you once again for having me here and look forward to an enriching discussion.
Thank you very much, Ms. Draal, for your time and for this amazing presentation. and for also your time to join this webinar and sharing the insights from the front lines of the climate action in India. That was a very great and outstanding example, and we truly hope that objectives and tasks set by the country will be achieved, leaving no one behind. And I believe GGI will be doing its best to support India in this endeavor. And thank you very much once again, Ms. Droll. And with that, I'm handing over the floor to my colleague, Ms. Diana Alejandra Quezada Avila, Senior Green Employment Officer here at Center for Thought Leadership in GGI. And over to you, Diana. Thank you, Anna. Let me just share my screen very fast. Oh, sorry. Maybe you can turn on the slides. Are you sharing them or am I sharing them? I think you are. Okay, so thank you once again, Anna and Ms. Roll, for the introduction and giving us this overview of what India is doing and how it connects just transitions in action with the LTLETs. So it was mentioned a couple of times, insight brief that GGI was developed, and I'm here to present to you basically the insights of this insight brief and how this can be translated into actions for improving the next iterations of LTLETs. So first of all, I would like to mention that the objective of this study was precisely to examine whether and how the long-term strategies of the different countries were incorporating the principles and the different aspects of just transitions. We decided to make this assessment on the G20 economies as a baseline, as the G20 economies might have sufficient resources and action points in order to implement these just transitions, and came up with best practices or examples for other developing economies in order to implement certain just transition practices. So we assessed 17 of the 20 G20 economies and their LTLETs. And within this assessment, one of the key aspects that we consider was that developing long-term strategies is an iterative process. It's a continuous and evolving process that requires implementing, then evaluating, and then changing what was best and what was not. The LTLETs present evolving scenarios of different economic situations and geographic and macroeconomic situations of the different countries. So there is not a single pathway to decarbonization. And these LTLETs and just transition practices reflect that. The approach then that we focused was evaluating the LTLETs, but also evaluating the different policies that each country has in order to address just transitions. For example, Mexico, as you can see in this graph, submitted their first LTLETs in 2016. Right now, they are working on updating their LTLETs. But in the meantime, their NDC, for example, has a strong component on LTLETs, and we consider that. We consider how along the years they have evolved in the just transition concept. Another thing that we consider is that, as it was already mentioned, just transition, it's a cross-sectoral and cross-cutting theme. it considers a lot of aspects. It's not only decarbonization, it also considers people, fairness, and so on. So we assess 7 areas of just transition. The climate and sustainability planning linked to the transition, the workforce development, innovation and research, regional and rural development, social support networks, economic development, and governance. Within each of these 7 areas, we assess different aspects. For example, in the governance mechanisms, we assess how inclusive the process was in order to develop just transition practices. If the process was anchored to a specific institution or anchored to a specific process, if there was actually human and financial resources allocated for the institution that was in charge for the just transition or for the just transition work. In climate and sustainability planning, we looked into how they acknowledge all these transition risks, how they identified the transition co-benefits in specific regions or in specific targeted groups, and if they acknowledge all the climate vulnerabilities for the specific groups that are most vulnerable for the transition. For workforce development, we did not only focus on the employment impacts of the transition, we also focus on other aspects of the labor market, quality of jobs, wages, and so on. For economic development, we assess if they were focusing on completely new businesses and industries for new opportunities after the transition, or if they focus on the business and industries who needed to transition. We looked into the resources available for that economic diversification. For rural and regional development, we focus on the opportunities for green growth development of the regions, and if the regions that were negatively affected by the transition were identified or they were talked about in more general ways. We also looked into innovation and research from both existing technologies and new technologies. And finally, we looked into social support. If they have social inclusion and social equity baselines, and if they looked into specific steps to make sure that social justice takes place, specifically in vulnerable groups. What we observed, and I am going to get into the results of the report already, was that 76% of the LT-LEDs that we assess actually mentioned just transitions. But it's very different how they include just transitions. We observed that only 59% have a dedicated section for just transition within the strategy. And overall, there are 2 types of approaches for just transition. Either it serves as an overarching and cross-cutting principle throughout the full strategy, or it's an individual aspect with a very targeted focus depending on the needs and vulnerabilities of the countries. For example, Argentina and South Africa consider this cross-cutting overarching principle of just transition, while Germany, for example, has a more strategic visualization of just transition based on the needs in certain sectors and certain regions. As I said, we looked into 7 areas of just transition, the one you can see here in the graph. The most prominent or most explained areas are the ones that you see in green. So basically, economic development, governance mechanisms, and innovation and research. And the least prominent or the least developed areas of just transition are the ones you see in red. So the relationship between climate sustainability and just transitions, and regional and rural development and just transitions. The aspects that you see in orange or in yellow are the ones that were highlighted as key aspects of the transition, for example, workforce development, but they lack clarity on specific actions to be implemented. And we will see this in more detail now. So the first and most prominent area was governance mechanisms. And 76% of all the LTLETs that we assess mentioned that developing a just transition aspects or including it within the strategy requires a participatory process with all the stakeholders and so on. But only 41% of all these LTLETs actually anchor this just transition process to a specific institution. And one of the key gaps that we observed during the analysis is that even if it is anchored within an institution, resources, either monetary or human capital, technical, and so on, are not allocated to actually implement and guide the just transition or the implementation of these LTLETs. We observe certain good practices within governance mechanisms, specifically in South Africa, for example. Their Climate Change Coordination Commission oversees the just transition by default. In South Korea, for example, they created a specific social conflict management system in order to predict and prevent any transition-related disputes for any sector. And in Turkey, for example, they mentioned that it took them 2 years of multi-stakeholder engagement process in order to properly include just transitions within their LTLETs. The second most prominent area for just transition was workforce development. But as I mentioned, workforce development has key main gaps. And the main gap is the identification of employment impact for those communities who are indirectly dependent on high carbon industries. So we have very detailed analysis on, for example, coal transitions, but we don't have an analysis of the value chain of the coal transition. So all the other industries that are related to coal are not covered within these transition pathways. Another gap that we identified was a specific support for affected workers. It was clearly identified that they needed support, but in some documents, they do not specify exactly how or what type of support is needed. Most of the strategies describe workforce challenges in very generic terms, without specifying the number of workers affected or the timelines for the impacts or a specific transition pathway. And the link between workers and job losses, as well as new green opportunities for those jobs, it's rarely made explicit. However, we find some good practices in certain G20 countries. For example, in the US, they have the Power Plus plan for targeted coal communities. In the UK, they have the Green Jobs Task Force, which provides a specific job estimates of impacts and transition. And Australia, which is committing to retrain workers in different sectors like construction, electrical trades, and advanced manufacturing. The third biggest area covered for just transition is economic development. But it's skewed towards new opportunities rather than managing decline. So, for example, stranded assets and carbon lock-in risks are mentioned in only a few of the strategies rather than across all of them. And while 53% of the identified industries that needs to phase out are identified, they do not provide clear roadmaps or supports for or mechanisms of support and timelines. One of the key gaps that we identify here was that explicit ambitions and predictable timelines for these phase-outs do not allow investors or workers or communities in order to develop a plan for these just transition and phase-out aspects to be implementable. On climate and sustainability area, we saw that it was an orange area, that it's considered, but it's not very well explained. Some of the key gaps here are the efforts to minimize transition risks. And one of the major gaps, I would say, it's the lack of monitoring and evaluation of mitigation targets against just transition indicators. And of course, the link between investment and financing needs and the just transition aspects, it's always lacking in 88% of the strategies that we assessed. For regional and rural development, we find that the regions that are negatively affected by the just transitions are not explicitly identified. And this might also be because at the end of the day, the long-term development strategies, or the LTLEDs, it's a high-level policy. But then in the other policy documents that we assessed, they were also not identified. So this lack of technical details actually hinder action. In some cases, we see good practices. For example, in Germany, it's very clear identify the lignite mining areas that will require support and what support it's going to be provided. In Australia, it's the same case. They acknowledge specific regions that will be facing this transition. And across all the European Union G20 countries and LTLEDs, they actually assigned a budget for it, for reskilling and for economic diversification. But for all other LTLEDs, it's somehow unclear the specificity of the regional and rural development that it's required. And finally, the two last aspects, but not least important, social support. There are no steps to make sure that the existing social injustices faced by the vulnerable groups are not exacerbated by the transition process. And on innovation, it is very prominent. All 82% of the LTLEDs assessed actually highlight innovation and research as a baseline for the just transition. However, this innovation, it's focused on mitigation, and there are few innovations or few research linked to developmental impacts, such as reducing poverty or reducing inequality. And the pathways to mainstream some of the novel technologies for mitigation, it's unclear. We can see very good practices. For example, Japan and South Korea provide very detailed sector-by-sector innovation roadmaps that lead towards implementation. But in other cases, it's also unclear how new technologies can affect mitigation and can result also in reduction of poverty or improvement of social development outcomes. So after all this assessment, we came up with 8 aspects that the next iteration of Just Transitions should consider improving or strengthening. So the first one is to provide more detail and clarity on who is affected. So the specific groups need to be identified, like in the case of Germany or Australia. Then discuss how fairness can be improved, understanding the mechanisms that lead to unfairness and key aspects to respond to this. Establishing clearer links with immediate social impacts. Linking these long-term development strategies with NDCs and BTORs and other development strategies at the short and medium term. Offer targeted regional support and be clear about the support that it's going to be provided. Include just transition as a guiding principle across or as a cross-cutting theme. Very important to monitor the impacts and the issues of the just transition in order to provide clear progress of how the just transition comes after. Clarify investment priorities and the financing needs. This is key to implement And it was also highlighted as one of the key uh, aspects in the just transition in India in the previous presentation. And finally, offer clear pathways for phasing out incompatible activities. So these are just some of the insights that we came up with this report. And I will invite you to download the report and read it in your free time. Or if you need more information about it, you can download the report and feel free to reach out if you have any questions or comments. We will be happy to address them. Thank you. Thank you, Diana. Thank you very much, Diana, for this presentation of the report. And I believe my colleague already posted the links to the publication of the presented report in the chat. And we also see a few questions to the presenters in the Q&A and in the chat. And maybe I guess Diana will be addressing them simultaneously as we proceed with other speakers, as we have a very great number of presenters today. And with that, I'm very happy to hand over to our colleagues from Indonesia, Adit Perdana, Policy Analyst of the Directorate of Climate Change Mitigation of Indonesia. And Adit Perdana, we are very happy to have you here, and over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, my colleague. Good morning. So actually, Triple GI invited our DG, but our DG have some important meeting, so that he assigned me to present the experience related to operationalizing Indonesia LT-led just transition commitments into concrete programs and projects. So I apologize to this morning not prepare the some presentation because the I signed in this morning so that I just to deliver my speech regarding our experiences to uh, um, personalizing Indonesia LTLETs into just transition commitments. So Indonesia long-term strategy for the low carbon and climate resilience is more than a technical roadmap for emission reduction. It is a framework for economic and social transformation. The goal, this our document aims to balance emission reduction with economic growth, justice, and climate resilience. This is the strategy with our mandate Indonesian constituents, with which is mandates the state to guarantee a decent life and a health environment for all citizens. So this our document to explain inclusivity about the implementation require a balance focus on government coordination and stakeholder engagement, specifically addressing gender equality, intergenerationality equity, vulnerable groups, and customary law community. So our concept and principle of just transition in LTS LCCR explicitly define the just transition of the workforce as a strategic supporting issues for the successful implementation. According to this document, Indonesia has committed to for the key intervention pillar for the pre-2030 pace. The first one is addressing regional and sectoral challenges. It is ensuring a decent future for the worker affected by the transition in specific cities or region heavily dependent on high carbon sector, such as the coal mining region, something like that. And the second one in promoting quality green jobs, aligning investment and climate policies to create to create quality employment in sustainable economic activities. And the third, human resources development. It is to strengthening and involving scaling, upskilling and reskilling programs to facilitate workforce access to new green opportunities. And then last one is participatory public dialogue, enhancing communication platform to ensure adequate social protection and well-being for workers and their communities. The document also highlight that the switch toward a low carbon system will generate significant economic opportunities, particularly in renewable energy, sustainable agriculture, and forestry. So, operationalizing principle, the just transition, we have some cooperation between the bilateral donor and multilateral development bank, such as the just energy transition pathways. The Just Energy Transition Partnership serve a primary vehicle to translate this LTS LCCR principle into concrete program and projects. So we are this project still undergoing implementation under Ministry of Economic Coordination Affair. They had developed some pillars. The first pillar is economic diversification. So the principle to addressing regional challenges, the under the ZP Comprehensive Investment and Policy Plan, especially focus on economic diversification project like the managed passing down of the coal plant through the energy transition mechanism now include social impact assessment and community transition funds to ensure that coal-dependent regions do not suffer economic collapse. The pillar two, the green skill bridge, the scaling, upscaling, and rescaling. The project identify priority green job in sector like geothermal, solar, and maybe battery manufacturing. And concrete project include establishing vocational training center in mining province to retrain workers for the renewable energy maintenance and logistics. And then the last one is inclusivity and gender mainstreaming. Gender equality and protecting vulnerable groups, and implementing gender responsive energy access to ensuring that rural women and marginalized community are not just passive recipient of clean energy but active participant in the new green value chains. So the last one is summary for the LTS LCCR provide the just mandate, while the chat brief provide the investment pathway. To move forward, we must ensure that this program remain grounded in participatory public dialogue as a mandate by our strategy to ensure that the transition is not only low carbon but truly equitable for the every Indonesian worker. It is our experiences, but we still undergoing in the implementation in energy sector. Thank you, Chair, and everyone.
Thank you very much, Mr. Verdana. And that's really exciting news on all the projects that you mentioned that are in the pipeline in the country. And we wish Indonesia strengths and all the best in this ambitious and great endeavors. And with that, since we are being very careful about the time, I'm very happy to hand over the floor to my colleague Camilla Roman, Senior Technical Specialist of the Priority Action Program on Just Transitions at the International Labour Organization. So over to you, Camilla. And thank you, Mr. Verdana.
Many thanks indeed for this invitation, and thanks to the previous speakers for the very enlightening insights. I'm sharing my screen, and now I'm gonna put it on slideshow. So if you can confirm that you can see that, that'd be great.
Yeah, we can see your screen, but not yet the slideshow. Thank you.
Right.
It worked. Thanks.
Perfect. Great. So I'm very happy to be here, and really excellent to hear all these findings and experiences when it comes to integrating just transition in LT-LEDs. Has been mentioned earlier, there are different instruments, different climate policy instruments that provide avenues to advance a just transition. So LT-LEDs are, of course, a very important one, but another one are NDCs that are near-term plans and therefore are very important complements to LT-LEDs. We are all very familiar with the fact that the last year was a crucial year for NDCs as the new generation of NDCs have been submitted. At the ILO, in partnership with the NDC partnerships and a university in Lausanne, we've carried out a mapping of how just transition has been integrated in this last generation of NDCs and comparing it to what happened in the previous round so as to monitor trends. So I hope that this provides some complementary insights to the discussions, and I hope that also that we can draw some reflections. There are some commonalities and complementarities between what can be done on just transition within LT-LEDs and within NDCs. So a couple of words on the objectives of this analytical exercise and the approach that we have taken. As I said, it was a collaboration with the NDC partnership and the École Polytechnique Fédérale de Lausanne, and it was supported by CEDA. In terms of our objectives, the idea was to keep on monitoring and analyzing the integration of just transition in NDCs, to have a baseline to monitor and assess change. It's also a knowledge base to inform the support that the ILO provides to countries on just transition in the context of NDCs and beyond. And it also served to provide inputs in international processes, including discussions under the UNFCCCs and particularly the Just Transition Work Program. When it comes to the approach that we've taken, our analytical framework is based on the ILO Just Transition Guidelines of 2015 that were endorsed by 187 member states of the ILO in 2023. And as you will see from the analysis, it resonates very much with also COP decisions that put forward key elements of a just transition, including the recent COP30 decision of the work program. In terms of what the mapping covers, it covers NDC 3.0, but it compares them also to the previous generation of NDCs. And we looked at 123 countries that submitted their NDC 3.0 up to November 30th of November 2025. We are going to do another exercise for an update later in the year as some other countries are submitting their NDCs right now. The focus of the analysis is on textual references of in the NDC texts themselves that were submitted to the UNFCCC. And this exercise complements qualitative case studies and analytical work that we've done in the course of the last couple of years. So what are we finding? We are finding that just transition is gaining traction across the board. When we look at explicit references, is again comparing the same countries, the same 123 countries, we see that the previous NDCs had explicit reference in 50% of the cases, and now it's up to 79%. We also see that the increase is happening across regions, with Asia and the Pacific seeing the greatest growth. We also see that it's not just the mention of just transition that is rising, but is also the number of references, the incidence of just transition, so how often they are mentioned, that is growing considerably. When we look at other considerations of just transition that are not explicit references but go beyond it, we also see, for instance, that employment is growing significantly. It was already quite present in the previous rounds of NDCs at 63%, but now it's basically at almost near NDC at 90%. That include concerns or issues around employment. And we also see a growth in terms of references to green jobs and decent work. Another aspect of just transition that is quite important and relevant is social inclusion and social equity. And there again, we see an important growth across different notions, from discrimination to social justice to equity and intersectionality. And we also, when we take a closer look at gender in relation to employment, decent work and just transition, we see that 59% of NDC 3.0 include references to gender in relation to employment and labor markets. But it's not just the mentions, let's say, of just transition that is important to consider. It's also what kind of provisions for follow-up actions we have and whether we have them at all. And indeed, we see a very important increase. We see that mentions of follow-up institutional arrangements that go beyond the NDC, so something that will be done to give effect to NDCs in terms of just transition strategies or frameworks or institutional setup, went from 27% to 51%. So we are now at over half. We also see that there is an increase of mentions of explicit resources allocated to a just transition. We are not talking about the majority of NDCs, but still a tenfold increase to 26% right now. And we also see that mentions of international cooperations related to just transition have grown. When it comes to just transition and importantly, also their implementation, there are a number of policy measures across different areas that are crucial. And these range from enterprise to skills to macroeconomic and growth policies. Again, we see very important rises. In particular, when we look at policies for sustainable enterprise development, skills development, and social protection, we've seen that now they're solidly present in more than half of the NDCs. And in many cases, it goes up to over 60%, or in terms of skills, 81%, which also resonates with some of the findings that were presented earlier on LT-LEDs. We also see that other aspects, other policy aspects of just transition have increased. And these concerns, for instance, social dialogue and tripartism, again, talking about governance, inclusive processes with employers and workers organizations are really key to deliver a just transition. And so we see an important increase, more than doubling over there. We also see, and this is something that we only looked at in relation to this round of NDCs, a very important presence of macroeconomic and growth policies that are aligned to a just transition, and industrial and sectoral policies that foster a just transition. What does this mean? It means, for instance, that you put in place incentives and incentive systems or growth strategies that are not just aligned to climate objectives, but are also aligned with social objectives. And the same holds for industrial and sectoral policy. So again, a strong attention for these aspects. Now, the important step is to turn our eyes onto implementation, and obviously this the NDC and the LTLED's provisions provide a good pathways, but the next step is really of turning these commitments into measures that can deliver on the ground is going to be key. And with that, I'll turn back over to you.
Thank you very much, Camilla, for sharing the insights from that publication, and also for your time to participate in this webinar. It's very insightful. I believe it's a great complementary research to our work presented by Diana today. Once again, thank you, and we will meet you again in the panel discussion for more details of the ILO's work. And with that, I'm very happy to hand over to our next and final speaker in this part of the webinar, Ms. Victoria Dimitrova, Associate from 2050 Pathways platform. And over to you, Victoria. Thank you, Camilla.
Thank you very much, and thank you everyone for the good discussions, and thank you for the invitation today. Maybe I'll just share my screen, and if you can let me know if you see my presentation, and
Yes,
I'll now put it in presentation mode, hopefully.
Okay, great.
Please.
It works. Thank you.
Okay. I'll try to keep it fairly short because I know that you want to have some time for the panel discussion afterwards. And yes, without further ado, thank you for the presentation. And just a few words for the ones who don't know us. 2050 Pathways Platform is a government and multi-stakeholder initiative that was launched to support a big tent approach to 2050 long-term climate strategies. And we currently have 39 members and have advised 62 countries on the elaboration and operationalization, now working more towards implementation of long-term strategies. We bring together a network of donors, international and national think tanks, and climate policy experts on long-term planning. On the right, you see the three key areas of our expertise and work. And with this short introduction, I wanted to also mention a report we're currently working on. And I want to start with a disclaimer that this report is currently under elaboration still, and all of the insights and patterns that we're finding, that we have found in alignment with the GGGI report, are still preliminary, and we'll be happy to share more final data and results in a few months' time. But starting from the objective of this report, essentially what we're trying to do is to capture the real-world impact of long-term strategies, test emerging findings with experts and practitioners, and distill lessons and practical recommendations for governments, development partners, and the UNFCCC process on how to maximize impact of long-term strategies as a practical instrument for implementation in the decade ahead. With this long kind of objective for the study, at the bottom you see it's a bit small. I hope you can see the kind of the gist of it. Is the methodological approach that we're using, starting from an overview and analysis of the 80 long-term strategies submitted to the UNFCCC to date. And we're currently at level 2 analysis, which adds on a survey approach to key stakeholders targeted across 40 countries. If any of the attendees of this webinar are interested to take part and share their perspective on how long-term strategies have performed and impacted other processes in their countries, I would be very happy to share the link, as we still have it open for a few more weeks. So please do not hesitate to let us know. And the next stage of the analysis is focused on case studies, which will dig deeper into specific impacts of long-term strategies with examples from countries. But at this stage, and with this said, I wanted also to spend a second to highlight why is this conversation on long-term strategy is important in general, and why is it important now? And I think it's a very timely and opportune moment to read through the Just Transition report from GGGI, which is an invaluable input to this analysis that we're trying to do as well through the flagship report, and to highlight that 2026 is shaping up as a landmark year for long-term strategy analysis. This makes sense because we now have more than 10 years since the instrument and the process exists. At the same time, we already have the second round of NDCs almost completed for all countries, and there is a second round of BDRs in preparation, as well as a process to shape the second global stock take. This gives us a really important window of opportunity to look at long-term strategies critically, and build a solid argumentation on how to further improve it. What are the elements that still need further development? And I think in the next slides, I'm focusing on the preliminary findings that are aligned to a large extent with the conclusions from the GGGI report as well. Very high level, very briefly, there is a convergence in diagnosis between the GGGI brief and the flagship report, in the sense that there is a recognition for just transition elements in almost all long-term strategies. Whilst we look at the 80 submitted in comparison to the 20 G20 ones, but there seems to be a pattern that is maintained. However, socioeconomic dimensions are the ones that are still needing some further development and enhancement. So, speaking to three specific gaps that seem to align also with the conclusions of the GGGI report, I would start with the socioeconomic analysis, where the GGGI brief indicates that only 29% of the G20 strategies identify specific groups, regions, and transition risk. And the initial analysis from the flagship survey confirms that wider socioeconomic impact assessment and climate risk and vulnerability assessment are the least included in the overall long-term strategy process elements. And this includes also not only the long-term strategy document itself that we see on the UNFCCC website, but any further iterations or processes that are complementing this strategy. This is very problematic, especially because in the survey we're framing it, we have questions asking stakeholders to assess to what extent different elements of the LTS process has been impactful and useful for the efficiency of the strategy as a whole. And this is one of the least indicated element, but it seems like there is a self-reinforcement problem, because if you don't have these aspects integrated in the long-term strategies to begin with, then it makes it harder for stakeholders to identify and assess their usefulness as well. A few examples that I think are interested in the way they approached socioeconomic impact of the strategies are Morocco, where this is one of the cases where we're looking at the process since the submission of the strategy that is currently on the UNFCCC website, because that submitted strategy is actually just the vision, the qualitative vision of the country, and there is further analysis that took place since then, including a macroeconomic assessment of the impact of the implementation of these measures. It is interesting to note here that even though there is already a macroeconomic assessment for Morocco, stakeholders find that this assessment could further deepen in terms of employment impacts. So they feel like it's not sufficiently clear, and it's not essentially doesn't give enough details to policymakers and regions on how to approach the impact on employment, even though there is already some elements of socioeconomic impact. And then there is Jamaica, where we recently worked with the climate change branch on the elaboration of a cost-benefit analysis for the implementation of their long-term strategy that was submitted to the UNFCCC last year. And here, an interesting approach is that we also integrated macroeconomic analysis in this cost-benefit analysis and had it further disaggregated to sectors. So you have details on GDP growth, aggregated and sectoral contributions, employment projections, aggregated and sectoral contributions, household consumption, fiscal variables, including revenues, pressures, and incentives, and debt to GDP ratio. So all of these elements, whilst not 100% exhaustive, because Just Transition requires a lot of details also on vulnerable groups, are giving detail, like information to policymakers to better prepare for an equitable climate action. With this, going to the second gap, which is focused a bit more on the regional and local dimension. And here again, the flagship survey responses are very aligned with the assessment of the GGGI brief, where they indicate that ensuring regional local plans aligned with long-term climate goals has the lowest effectiveness rating of all outcomes that we had assessed as part of the theory of change of the study. It's interesting also to observe that to date, and again, a disclaimer that we're still assessing and receiving further responses to the survey, there seems to be a regional kind of divide and difference in assessment, where Africa and Asia respondents rate long-term strategies significantly less effective at local and regional level versus Europe, North America, and Oceania. This could as well be reflecting a difference in subnational policymaking infrastructure, but it's an interesting insight that I thought would share and will further dig deeper into in the next stage of the analysis. Of course, it is obvious to also note that national strategies that don't disaggregate spatially and by groups cannot design meaningful support for affected communities, and it's essential to integrate these. A short example, again, I think it was mentioned already in the GGGI Insights presentation before on Japan, where we got feedback from subnational stakeholder representative who indicated that their subnational planning is fully aligned with the national LT-LETs and consistently references all measures and considerations. With this, the third one is a gap identified and in alignment with the GGGI brief is focused on monitoring and just transition outcomes, where the MRV is consistently flagged as top priority for strengthening, often linked to financing and tracking progress. This comes in parallel with an assessment of the survey, kind of insight from the survey, that broader macroeconomic and socioeconomic conditions are the most constraining factor for long-term strategy success. And this is further worsened by the fact that if you don't have a proper MRV or monitoring process to assess how just transition is taking place, and if it is just indeed, this can result in situations where the strategies is considered unfit for purpose and all activities are stalled without sufficient assessment and analysis of other options. With one more feedback from Morocco, where we hear that strengthening M&E and better integrating socioeconomic dimensions such as jobs, just transition, territorial development would make long-term strategies more operational. And I'll leave you with just 3 practical recommendations based on these insights and just really striking alignment with the insights between the 2 analytical reports. Is that we need socioeconomic assessment further integrated into long-term strategies, and the disaggregation by region, sector, vulnerable group is essential. Then also mapping transition impacts at subnational level and explicitly to investment sequencing and policy design, and the third one being the need to embed just transition indicators into existing BDR and MRV frameworks to avoid fragmentation and parallel reporting systems. With this, I stop, and I think it was longer than I planned. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Victoria, for this exciting early insights and also for the practical recommendations. I believe a few colleagues already on the chat were curious about the slides, and if you don't mind, we will share the slides with the participants after this presentation. Once again, thank you so much. And with that, we are very happy to move to the panel discussion. We have a few amazing panelists lined up and waiting to speak. And with that, I'm very happy to move and hand over the floor to our next moderator, Stelios Grafakos, Principal Economist at the Center of Thought Leadership at GGGI. And over to you, Stelios. Thank you, Victoria.
Thank you, Anna. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, anywhere you are. So let's move to the panel discussion. I would like to ask Camila and Victoria to remain and keep their cameras on. And we would like to welcome also two panelists, Ramon San Pascual, who is independent expert on climate, health, and environment in the Philippines, and also Mr. Ashok Kumar Tanikonda. This is our senior program officer in the country office in India from the Global Green Growth Institute. So I would like to ask one question to Camila and Victoria. Please keep your answers short and concise. Based on your experience working with different countries, how are countries moving from strategy, as we saw, LT-LEDs, NDC, so on and so forth, to more concrete just transition action, and which institutional or financing or stakeholder engagement approaches are proving most effective? If you could give us one or two examples on that, it will be great. So, Camila, over to you.
Thanks, Stelios. And indeed, moving on to implementation is really an essential priority once the commitments are lined up. So three things. The first is to turn commitments into implementation. The first is policy alignment. We don't need a proliferation of policies that go in different directions, but we need the convergence and we need policy integration. So we were talking about references to workforce development, skills or social protection, industrial development in NDCs. These needs to be translated into industrial policies, skills development, social protection system that help to meet those commitments. So policy convergence and policy alignment. The second one is finance, developing invest or embedding just transition financing needs in investment plans and investment framework is key, as well as its bridging policies and investment priorities with investment projects that sometimes we see a disconnect between the two levels. And the second is systems of governance that are effective in terms of ensuring that the implementation is also based on social dialogue and stakeholder engagement, but also having accountability mechanisms that are not just within the context of the UNFCCC, but are also present at the domestic level that will help to ensure or support that the results are actually delivering on the ground.
Thanks, Camila. That was very concise and concrete, very clear. Victoria, how about your perspective on this and the 2050 Pathways Platform perspective?
Thank you, Stelios. And I think it's actually echoing very many of the points that Camila made as well, starting from perhaps stakeholder engagement, which we see as well in the emerging findings from the flagship report. Almost all of the countries indicate stakeholder engagement as the strongest tool to secure just transition. And this is something that we see, like, for example, very well elaborated stakeholder engagement process in Fiji resulted for the long-term strategy being the reference point and document for the NDC, the Energy Master Plan, the National Development Plan, and their Vision 2050. Then we do have as well the process and experience example from Peru, where the whole elaboration of the LTS took quite a few years, aiming to integrate the climate planning into the national development planning process and reach as many stakeholders as possible. The strategy itself is based on the idea of human development and well-being, and as such, it is also a good example of how do you move. Then, what are the key indicators per sector that you need to follow in order to deliver a just transition. Then I think the second kind of area of how countries are doing it well is also the institutional arrangement where long-term strategies are essential. One of the examples I had already kind of had in my mind was also mentioned in the slides from the GGGI team on South Korea, where they have integrated into their LTS in institutional framework social conflict management system, which is a very anticipatory approach to how do you resolve conflict and trade-offs between different priorities. Then in Colombia, it's a really good example as well because there they integrated very deeply into the ministry capacity to monitor and then update and course correct the modeling for the long-term strategy and then further align it with short-term action. Important to note here is that we get feedback that this capacity is very mitigation and GHG tracking focused, but further attention needs to be put on just transition. And then the last one being financing that Camila also mentioned, where a good example, well, all of them can further, we can learn from all of them, but a good example of long-term strategy and finance linking is actually South Africa, where they consistently reference it, the long-term strategy as the basis for their JETB conversations. And there's also the whole, and like just transition is a cross-sectional across all of the strategy itself. So I'll stop there to not further extend, but these were the three elements I wanted to mention.
Thanks. Great examples from different countries on institutional arrangements, policy alignment, financing. Let's move on now to hear the perspective of civil society representative. Ramon, I will turn to you. I would like to ask you, from a civil society perspective, how can just transition processes better ensure that the needs and the voices of the vulnerable and affected communities are reflected in the implementation of LTLEDs?
Thank you so much. I hope you can hear me clearly.
Yes, loud and clear.
I'm participating from very warm weather of Manila. A just transition could only work if those who bear the greater risk would also shape the benefit. And I would recommend 6 or 7 actions that can strengthen particularly the perspective as well as the actual uh, participation of those who are most vulnerable. One that shift, because we are so used to having consultations, I think we should go beyond that and make vulnerable communities as co-decision maker, whether this is in the different committees of the transition, in the actual transition planning, or even in developing designs, whether for transition and transportation, in energy, and even particularly from the sector that I worked with for over the last 10 years as executive director of Healthcare Without Harm in the healthcare sector itself. That's one. Second is to build community evidences as well as narratives. Uh, community-led vulnerability assessments are happening all over the place. This should be uh, communicated and translated into language that can be understood by other community groups. Gender and social inclusion analysis are also taking place. Again, this should be transformed into some effective communication platforms. The third action I would suggest is to demand equitable financing mechanism because communities' participation is restrained by the very lack or limited resources that they have, unlike other sectors or other participants. So civil society can advocate for just transition fund for workers, small farmers, fisher folk, and micro enterprises. And I think a great example of this is what is exactly happening now during this energy crisis, that many sectors are impacted, and yet government are trying to work by providing actual funding support. So those who are most affected can cope up, whether these are the drivers, the farmers, the fisher folks, and even the small enterprises. And the fourth action is to strengthen the capacity of local stakeholders to engage in long-term planning as well as in terms of actual project development that will exemplify how this will work down from the macro to the community level. Civil society in that case can translate those concepts into local languages, train communities on their rights, on energy literacy, which are very technical, and even climate mitigation and governance. The fifth action is to protect the rights of these vulnerable communities and to prevent harm because transition can always be harmful, particularly to those who have the least in this community. So transition should be avoid unjust transition and injustices should be avoided. So therefore, civil society can push for stronger human rights safeguard, do no harm screening for renewable energy, and we're doing this in many through the what we call as health impact assessment of energy projects. And then the last action is to institutionalize multi-stakeholder governance, meaning not only to consult at a certain pace, but throughout the entire transition planning implementation, the governance structure should already cover participation and actual engagement of the different stakeholders, including the most vulnerable. Thank you so much.
That's great. Thank you so much for those very important points and giving also some examples. Let me move now to our colleague, Ashok. How GGGI is advancing just transition support to the government of India. We saw an overall framework in the study, but we need to see more concrete examples how GGGI supports the government of India, particularly through energy projects on the ground and related policy work. We would especially welcome your reflections on practical challenges, limitations, barriers, and lessons learned from implementation.
Right. Thank you, Stelios. GGG, we have been supporting Government of India at the state government level and the federal government level, central government level through various projects. We are working across, mainstreaming low carbon buildings across the country. We are supporting floating solar projects in the eastern region, which is one of the prime candidates for just transition because it does support the entire coal economy, coal and steel economy, right? We are helping diversify them into floating solar projects. We are also supporting the southern part of India in an upcoming project through food prevention of food loss and waste. And we are also, last year, we've also supported central government agency with a $500 million green bond. This is the range of interventions we're doing. We are also working on a pipeline that supports greening the steel industry, which is again from the Eastern Belt, because the Indian iron ore is of slightly lower quality, and it becomes really important customizing the evolving green hydrogen technologies and green steel DRI technologies to this region, because millions are dependent on the jobs out of this, and in the light of say CBAM, etc., it becomes really important to maintain the export competitiveness of this sector. Now, in terms of challenges, I think in terms of green bonds, the issue has been that the model is fairly well demonstrated. It's just that keeping up with the evolving taxonomies, ensuring credible impact assessments and reporting, maintaining that the proceeds are very clearly labeled only to green assets is a ongoing process. Where we get actual challenges is, the absence of greenium advantage, for example, given the current domestic international financial situation. That is one. But in terms of issues like low carbon buildings, which, by estimates, India is yet to build 70% of its building stock by 2030 or 2032. That amount of buildings are yet to come up, right? And there is a huge potential to transition these into low carbon buildings. But the data in terms of where these buildings are, what's the energy consumption, what are the kind of materials that are going into, and how do we influence these material choices, there is a huge data challenge. There is a huge project preparation challenge. The capacities of this various state, obviously buildings are more under the ambit of the state governments, right? And the municipalities. The capacities of these agencies have to be amplified, supported through project preparation facilities that also connect finance. Finally, I think also, and I think in terms of food loss, even though we're approaching it from a mitigation lens, prevention of food loss and waste, there's a very strong adaptation angle, because at the heart of it, you're talking about the livelihoods of farmers and long-term sustenance, right? But that is something we have to keep in mind. But there again, the allocation of water resources in a rapidly warming world under highly water-stressed regions, the choice of crops, the incentives in terms of what kind of vegetables or foods you are producing. It goes way beyond just a very project and technology specific intervention, right? We cannot just wish away by saying, okay, we'll install a lot of cold chain infrastructure and then it will solve for this. It's a very complex problem. But finally, I think also in terms of financing, even the multilateral funds, etc., right now, I think they're heavily focused on do no harm kind of approach with compliance kind of outlook. I think to really achieve the just transition outcomes, we need to go beyond that, target the right stakeholders, and also link, like how in say instruments like green bonds, we're pegging it to the reduction of carbon emissions. We must also link these instruments to the creation of jobs, alleviation of poverty, and other such indicators. These are some of our reflections from the support we are doing to Government of India.
Thank you so much. Very insightful. I see we're running out of time, so I would like to thank the panelists for their insights, moving from planning to implementation and how we incorporate just transition elements. And we got some just transition examples also on stakeholders engagement and projects on the ground from GGGI in India. So I will pass it over to Anna for closing the webinar. Thank you so much for the panelists for their contributions.
Thank you very much, Stelios. And once again, thank you very much to all our distinguished guests, to the speakers. to the governments that found time to attend and also share the insights from their work, to our amazing panelists sharing their experience from the ground, and to all the guests and participants of this event. GGI will be sharing the recordings of this event together with the slides and also a few insights. And those questions, I know my colleague Diana was deliberately addressing the questions in the Q&A and also in the chat. But for those questions that were not addressed during the session, we'll follow up and provide the answers from our experts. And with that, we are very ready to close this event. One more time, thank you so much for your time and wish you a very pleasant day, afternoon, evening, or morning. And thank you and goodbye.
Thank you,
Bye.
everyone. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Goodbye.